Hi, hello. This video is going to talk about a question that has been asked on actually one of your YouTube comments. How to access a user session information in JavaScript. And then there was a follow-up question on the BMC community where someone else asked how to get user information on the backend. So why would you want to do that? So maybe you have some code on the UI and you want to get the user email, you want to see if the developer mode is enabled, you want to see his login ID. And on the backend, the person on the community wanted to check that the user was a specific user, for example, to check the permissions or something else. So how is that working? So here you have an example, so which is get user information. And here, as you can see that I created a view component, and the view component is displaying, these are part of information you can get from the UI. So the full name, the developer ID, if the developer mode is on, if he is an administrator, and his login ID. And those are some information coming from the backend. So I created a custom REST API that is called by the view component. And the REST API is simply returning some information coming, from the user object on the backend. So when you load the example, you will have a little message because, of course, this data is immediately sent back because it's a UI, but this you have to call the REST API and the REST API has to come back. So how is that working? So we have a view component user info, and this view component has a directive. So let's focus first on the UI information. So if you want to get information in the UI, you can use the BMC method we provide, service we provide, which is Rx current user. And you have simply to get Rx current user.get, and then you will have some information like the full name, developer ID, developer mode, administrator, or get name. So pretty straightforward. You don't have to do anything. You simply have to call this service and just do .get. So this covers, and of course this information is for the logged in user, for the current session. So if you want to do it on the backend, here you can see that I'm calling custom REST API. So here I'm using an Rx resource object. So I don't know if you had talked about it before, but so an Rx, if you want to call a REST API, you have several ways to do it. One of them is using $HTTP. So I don't know if I did that in my example. It doesn't seem so. Okay, so you have one example. You can use the AngularJS $HTTP to call a REST API. We don't advise you to do it for some reason. One of them is when you do a put or a post call, you have to, in your header, have a specific header, like HTTP request and something like that. So you have to set some specific HTTP headers when you do a put or post call. So we do that automatically for you. So if you use $HTTP, it won't be done for you. So you will have to do it yourself. So if you don't want to do it, what you can just do is use Rx resource. In Rx resource, what you really need to do is just to instantiate this Rx resource, and you give the URL. So here, for example, the URL from my REST API is com example sample library REST user info get my info. And what I'm calling get user info. So here I have a resource object. I'm calling get user info. It's going simply to call this resource object and the get method. Here I'm not expecting any get parameters, so I'm passing an empty string. If you don't put anything, it's going to trigger an error. So if you have a guest REST API which doesn't expect any parameters, just put an empty string, or else it's not going to work. So anyway, it's going to return a promise. And so in this promise, you can have a then and or a catch. Catch if you have an error, like 404 or something went wrong on the backend. So anyway, so when the call goes out to the backend, we get a user info object, and we just use login name, user ID, full name, email address that we put inside here. So we have a ton of information, and this one call from the backend. So this one comes from backend. So on the backend now, we have a REST API somewhere. User info. So we have I created a user info object class. So with only a few attributes like login name, user ID, full name, email address ID. It's very important to use JSON property decorator because automatically Jackson is going to transform or cast, I don't know if it's the right term, but it's going to cast the object, the Java object, into JSON to send it to the front end. So just use JSON property. So if you are using JSON property, by default you just need setters. In our case we don't need getters. So the goal is to get information and send back this user info object. So in the REST API itself, it's pretty simple. So the main path is REST user info. The path of the REST API is get my info. No parameters. So what you need to do in order to get user information, you need to locate the user service. So this is a BMC service. So we already use the service locator in another REST API, but so service locator get user service is going to get this user service for you. And from this user service, you want to return a user object. So you do get user, and we don't have a method get current user. So we don't have that. We saw that the other day when the question was asked. We might have in the future, but right now we don't. So the trick is to use the keyword $user$ that all-timer remedy will remember. And $user$ is a keyword to tell, well, the current user. So here I'm saying, well, give me the information for the current logged in user. So here I have my user info object. I'm setting the email address, full name, ID, login name. There are more information, so you can just use auto-completion to see user dot and see what other information you have. And I'm returning the user info object. And automatically Jackson is going to produce a JSON. So when the REST API comes back, I have my user info object, and I can access the login name, user ID, full name, email address, which are the information from user info. Login name, user ID, full name, email address, ID. So that's how you get user information from the UI with X current user. And from the backend, you have to locate the user service. And once you get your user service, you can just call getUser with a username, and you will have a user object.